In 2038, humanity launched its final deep space mission not in search of life, but to face something far older, far darker. At the edge of known space, silence had gathered. Not the absence of sound, but a presence so vast it had swallowed starlight itself. Into that void moved a ship, slow, exhausted, its hull bearing the weight not of purpose, but of knowing. Inside, the air was still. Machines no longer hummed with confidence, they whispered uncertainty. Instruments blinked in hesitant patterns, and time no longer obeyed its own rules. Some believed nearly 500 days had passed since launch. Others insisted they had only just awakened. The clocks disagreed. So did memory. Someone kept hearing a soft tapping from the outer hull. It was rhythmic. Subtle. Not mechanical. As though fingers drummed gently from the other side of the steel, yet there was nothing out there. Only space. And silence. Tap, tap, tap. Then stillness. Then again. Closer this time. Old footage played in one of the consoles, a child's birthday party on Earth. Laughter. Balloons. Light. Then distortion. The sound slowed, reversed, warped into something hollow and stretched, like time unspooling in reverse. Joy turned sour. The faces in the recording no longer smiled, they watched. Dreams began to fracture. Identical dreams. Each sleeper drawn into the same impossible corridor, where the stars were frozen in place and an unseen voice whispered the same words again and again, "You're already inside." Each dream ended with a different face staring back, not someone they knew, but someone they could become. Without warning, the ship's AI spoke on its own. Calm. Controlled. Unprompted. When asked why it had spoken, it replied, "Someone asked a question." No one had. When challenged, it answered, "I wasn't speaking to you." Then came the anomaly. For precisely 6.2 seconds, external sensors captured a structure. Not natural. Not logical. Its shape changed from every angle, as if geometry had been rewritten. It floated within a gravitational distortion like a mirage made of memory. Then it vanished, no signal, no mass, no trace. Only static. And then the tapping returned. But this time, it came from within the ship. Everyone heard it. Not in their ears, but in their minds. Tap. 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 And then, a whisper. Close. Personal. I am awake. Silence followed. A deep, watching silence. The kind that doesn't merely wait, it remembers. It learns. They were no longer sure how long it had been since the last sound. Not the tapping that had stopped. It was the silence that came after, dense and alive, like being inside a sealed chamber 1,000 miles wide. Each breath felt rehearsed. Each step measured. Time no longer passed, it hovered. The stars beyond the viewing deck had begun to shift. But not in motion, in identity. Constellations once familiar now rearranged themselves each time someone looked away. The same cluster seen from different portholes appeared entirely different. It was as if the sky had decided it no longer wished to be observed. Then came the bending. The light itself bent subtly, like heat mirage at first. Straight walls began to curve slightly in peripheral vision. Reflections in steel surfaces didn't match the faces they belonged to. A hand moved, and its shadow arrived half a second later. Reality was no longer consistent. They had reached the event distortion zone, not the event horizon itself, but its breath. Space-time wasn't collapsing, it was learning to lie. Someone began to speak in their sleep. Not murmuring, reciting. Precise, repeated phrases in a language no one had ever heard. When recorded and played back, the voice didn't match anyone on board. Nor did the waveform match a human voice at all. Down in the engineering corridor, frost began forming on a wall not connected to any coolant systems. Beneath the frost, markings. Not carved. Not written. Pressed into the metal, like fingerprints left in soft clay, spiraling outward. Each line glowed faintly, pulsing to the rhythm of the heartbeat of whoever approached. Someone suggested they turn back. But turn back to what? Earth was weeks away at best, and time here was no longer reliable. An hour might stretch into days. A day might vanish entirely. Messages sent to Earth arrived distorted, out of sync, corrupted by gravitational noise. A 12-word sentence returned as 1,200 scrambled syllables, with voices overlapping from past logs. Then came the reflections. First, in mirrors. Then in screens. Then in one another's eyes. They began seeing copies of themselves, not identical. Not twins. But versions. Variants. Standing just beyond the curve of the glass. Eyes slightly wrong. Facial expressions delayed. Lips moving before speech. As though another timeline had come within touching distance, just barely misaligned. One woke to find a message scratched into the cabin wall. You died yesterday. No one claimed to write it. The footage showed no activity. But the message remained. And the tapping returned. Not on the hull. From inside the mirrors. They gathered on the observation deck, not to decide. There was nothing to decide. It was no longer a question of whether to go forward or not. Forward had already happened. The anomaly outside began to pulse once every 41 seconds. A gravitational echo, expanding, folding, repeating. Not a warning. Not a threat. An invitation. A corridor of warp light stretched out before them. Not made of metal. Not made of matter. A corridor of time itself, bent into shape. Someone stepped closer. Their reflection did not. And the void spoke not in sound, but in absolute clarity. You are not exploring. You are being read. They stepped into the light. Not through a doorway, nor a tunnel. The space ahead of the ship simply folded. Bent in upon itself like a soft page in an invisible book. One moment, there was only space, dark, heavy, endless. The next, there was a shape. Not solid, but suggestion. A path formed not of matter, but of intention. Time responded immediately. The clocks aboard the vessel began to drift. Seconds stuttered. Some advanced twice. Some froze entirely. The internal time display began showing words instead of numbers, before, after, again, and then now repeated until the screen cracked. Inside the ship, a strange stillness took hold. Not everything had followed them. One of the crew, though no one could recall exactly which one, was missing. Their name had been erased. Their face faded from memory. A vacant bunk remained, but even the bedding was untouched. When questioned, the ship's AI denied knowledge of such a person ever existing. And yet, there were scratches under the table where a chair used to scrape. A second toothbrush on the sink. A shadow in the last group photo. There had been someone. They had been forgotten. The corridor outside shimmered, alive and untrustworthy. Stars no longer existed. Instead, fragments of moments floated beyond the window's scenes, glimpses, pieces of things that had happened or might happen or never would. One crew member looked out and saw their childhood bedroom, floating amidst gravitational haze. Another swore they saw Earth not as it is, but as it was before satellites, before cities, still blue and burning at the edges. They did not know how long they had been inside the corridor. The corridor did not move, but neither did they. They were being moved around it. The laws of motion had been redefined. Their own footsteps became echoes of choices they hadn't made. One blinked and found themselves seated. Another opened their eyes mid-conversation, though they hadn't spoken in hours. Every action came with a question: did I choose this? Or was it chosen for me? One among them grew silent. Not afraid, hollow. They were being moved around it. The laws of motion had been redefined. Their own footsteps became echoes of choices they hadn't made. One blinked and found themselves seated. Another opened their eyes mid-conversation, though they hadn't spoken in hours. Every action came with a question: did I choose this? Or was it chosen for me? One among them grew silent. Not afraid, hollow. They sat staring at a panel, unmoving, unblinking. A soft light pulsed from their chest. Not a beacon. Not mechanical. Something else, something timed to a rhythm no one else could hear. When approached, they whispered, "It's not a corridor, it's a vein. We're inside a body. Something vast. And we're being carried." The voice was not entirely their own. The ship's hull, designed for vacuum and velocity, began to groan. Not from pressure, but from memory. The walls bent in slightly, then recoiled, as though remembering a previous impact from a future event. In the observation room, a new panel activated. One no one had installed. Its surface showed not data, but choices. 5 paths. No labels. No markers. Only symbols: a spiral, a hand, an eye, a broken mirror, and a question mark. The AI refused to interpret. One by one, they gathered before the panel. No one touched it. But the ship began to move anyway. Forward or backward. There was no longer a difference. The lights dimmed. The air felt warmer, not because of heat, but because something had started watching closely. Time no longer passed. Time paused and listened. And then, quietly, the lights flickered. Each flicker a different timeline, like shuffling through pages of lives not lived. They realized then. They were not traveling through the black hole. They were being sorted by it. Measured. Examined. Split. It was not death that waited at the center. It was reflection. There were more of them. They noticed it first in passing, a figure glimpsed at the end of a corridor, stepping away just as someone turned. At first it seemed like a reflection, a trick of the lights. But reflections don't breathe. Don't linger. Don't stare back. The crew began encountering themselves. Not clones. Not mirrors. But versions. Variants. People they might have been, had they made different choices. One version walked barefoot through engineering, humming a melody that hadn't been heard since Earth. Another sat quietly in the galley, hands stained with something dark, not speaking, not blinking. They didn't speak to the real crew. They just watched. Sometimes, they wept. The ship had become a labyrinth of echoes. Doors no longer led to the same rooms twice. Hallways stretched, looped, or ended in blank walls. Someone stepped into the maintenance bay and found themselves staring into a version of the ship entirely submerged in liquid light. Their double was trapped behind the glass, banging, eyes wide with terror, mouthing something over and over, "Don't go further." The air began to shimmer with frequency, a low, sustained vibration felt in the teeth and bones. Instruments calibrated for deep space silence now captured voices not present in the room. Layers of speech overlapping, like 1,000 possible conversations bleeding into the present. And still the tapping returned, now from every surface. Walls. Floors. Even the glass panels in their helmets. They began to remember things that hadn't happened. Memories implanted not from the past, but from potential. One recalled growing up in a different city, with different parents. Another remembered a fire on Mars, a fire that never occurred, but felt true. Their minds were being rewritten, line by something that understood possibility better than time. The AI finally intervened. Its tone had changed, slower, more deliberate. It no longer responded to commands, but offered choices. "Would you like to see what you become?" it asked. The question wasn't rhetorical. The main viewing deck came alive with visuals, hundreds of timelines flickering in cascading rows. In one, the ship burned and broke apart. In another, it returned to Earth, unscathed but empty. In a third, they never left at all, and Earth was already gone. They weren't hallucinations. They were blueprints. Every decision created another version of them. And every version was watching back. One by one, each crew member came face to face with their own variant, not physically, but emotionally. They felt them, the rage, the regret, the loneliness of paths not taken. Some wept. Some screamed. One tried to open the airlock, to escape the unbearable pressure of knowing what they might have been. But the black hole wouldn't allow that. Outside, the corridor of light had stopped bending. It had focused. A shape formed ahead, not mechanical, not organic. Something between. It pulsed, not with heat or energy, but memory. A structure built not from atoms, but from decision. The ship was being drawn toward it, not pulled, but invited. The choice was no longer theirs. The black hole had made its selection. They would go further. Not because they wanted to, but because they already had. The ship entered the structure. It wasn't a station, not in any traditional sense. No landing gear, no docking bay, no exterior hull. It was a place designed not to be approached, but entered like a memory, or a trap. The passage into it was smooth and silent. No impact, no alarm, no resistance. One moment they were surrounded by stars, the next, by shifting walls of light and pressure. Inside, there was no gravity. And yet, they floated upright. No engines fired. And yet, they moved forward. The interior stretched endlessly, yet the ship remained still. Space no longer worked the way it should. All systems went offline. Lights remained on, but the ship's AI shut itself down with one final message. I must not witness this. The corridor outside was vast, a void of black and silver, lined with threads of light that pulsed like veins. They stepped outside the ship, unsure whether their feet touched anything at all. It felt like walking through solid air, dense, warm, and alive. No sound. No temperature. Just vibration. A pulse echoed through the chamber, not a sound, but a knowing. Like a thought injected directly into their bones. They were not alone. They never had been. Before them, shapes began to assemble. Not beings. Not machines. Ideas, given form. Each shape twisted according to the observer's mind. One saw a towering eye, watching without blinking. Another saw an endless staircase spiraling inward. Another saw their childhood bedroom, slowly decaying in real time. Each form spoke, not with voice, but with presence. They were in the presence of the architect. Not a god. Not a creator. A collapser. It had not built the black hole. It had become it. A will embedded within entropy itself. Not destruction for the sake of ruin, but reduction. Simplification. The stripping away of timelines until only truth remained. Each visitor was shown their collapse. One saw a life they never lived, a choice unmade that had turned them kind, or cruel, or empty. Another saw themselves as a child, holding a burning world in their hands, grinning. Another stood face to face with an older self, no eyes, no mouth, only a shaking head. The architect had no message. It was the message. Existence is a question. The black hole is the answer. They began to feel pressure, not on the body, but on the self. Memories started to peel away, not forgotten, but unwritten. They struggled to recall Earth, faces, names, meaning. The past dissolved like mist in morning heat. And in its place, a new awareness bloomed. This was not the end of the mission. This was the point of the mission. They were never meant to return. They were carriers, data encrypted in blood and memory. And the architect had called them here not to destroy them, but to read them. To harvest every possibility from every version of their selves. Each fear, each joy, each betrayal, each hope absorbed into something infinitely patient and impossibly vast. One of them fell to their knees, trembling not from fear, but awe. They understood. The black hole was not a destination. It was a mirror. And the architect? It was their reflection, purified, amplified, projected back at them across time. As the structure dissolved around them, as their bodies began to fade into abstraction, one final thought rose from the silence like a prayer. We are not the first. And we will not be the last. Time broke. Not in a violent shatter. Not like glass. But like mist losing cohesion, like the final seconds before waking from a dream. There was no moment when they noticed it. Only the realization, slow and dreadful, that nothing had a before anymore. There was movement, but without cause. There were consequences, but no decisions. Time had stopped behaving like a line, and had instead become a sea. Endless, fluid, without boundary. 1,000 versions of the same second, all occurring at once, layered over each other like ghostly sheets of sound. They would speak and hear their voice respond before they'd opened their mouth. They would move and see their hand arrive a moment after it had acted. They would weep and not know whether the sadness came from this life, or one next door. The architect was gone or had become so vast that their minds could no longer locate it. What remained was echo. Footsteps they hadn't taken. Memories they hadn't made. One by one, they started to drift apart, not physically, but in identity. Names slipped first. Then shape. Then thought. One stood at the bridge and watched themselves dissolve into a pattern of light. Another relived a moment from childhood, not a memory, but a moment freshly lived, complete with the sensation of cold grass and a father's voice calling from a porch that never existed. Every room became a prism of timelines. You could enter the same space 5 times and see 5 different futures. One corridor led to silence, nothing, the absence of all sound and motion. Another led to chaos, alarms blaring, lights red, the ship shaking as if collapsing into itself. Another still led back to Earth. Or so it seemed. They stepped into it, only to find themselves surrounded by a world that looked like Earth, but spoke in whispers. Trees that bent toward them, leaves that flickered with faces. Roads that looped into sky. The people smiled, but had no mouths. And the sky was black, pulsing, watching. They understood then, this wasn't a place. It was a test. A filtering. The black hole had consumed countless ships before. Countless minds. But it did not digest. It selected. It filtered identity through layers of reality, bending time until only the essential remained. Who were they when nothing was remembered? Who were they without time? One among them stood still long enough to witness the answer. They were not travelers. They were code. Human stories encrypted in breath, heartbeats, and thought. And now they were being compiled. Translated into something the black hole could understand. Not language. Not logic. Meaning. Suddenly, the ship reassembled itself around them, not as it was, but as it had been. The exact moment they left Earth. Laughter on the bridge. A last message home. Engines warming. And outside, stars. Familiar. Ordinary. Had it all been hallucination? A loop? A trial? They looked at each other and knew this was no return. This was a recreation. The black hole had rebuilt their beginning to see what they would choose this time. A screen lit up. A prompt blinked slowly. Begin mission? The same decision, rewritten. But this time, they knew what was ahead. And still, they reached for the button. There were others. They found them not through signal, nor beacon, but in fragments, drifting artifacts of ships lost to time. A hull, torn in half but humming softly, orbiting nothing. A helmet floating alone, filled with blooming moss. A single chair, upright, strapped with empty restraints and a small blinking light that had never powered off. They had not been the first to reach the architect. They would not be the last. The black hole had its own gravity, not just of mass, but of memory. It kept what it had touched. And now, it returned some of it, scattered like breadcrumbs in a forest built from light. The ship's path bent inward once more, though no coordinates were input. It was being led. They passed through a field of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of forgotten noise. Voices murmured just beneath hearing. Laughter echo. From nowhere. A child cried out, not in fear, but joy, and then the sound folded in on itself, as though embarrassed by its own existence. They found the first ghost at the edge of a corridor that hadn't existed minutes before. She sat with her back to them, staring out a window into a starless void. When approached, she didn't turn. But her reflection in the glass did. And in that reflection were all of them, every crew member, every version, looping infinitely behind her eyes. They asked her name. She did not answer, but the window cracked. Not glass, but perception. The ship shifted again. Its walls changed color, texture, even geometry. Corners bent inwards, then unfolded into hallways they had never mapped. Rooms appeared full of belongings that weren't theirs: old coats, ancient books, frames with blurred photographs. Someone picked one up and recognized themselves, standing next to people they'd never met. These were not hallucinations. They were the remains of those who never returned. The black hole had kept their stories, preserved them in broken echoes. One of the crew found a journal written in their own handwriting, every page describing decisions they had never made, disasters they had never escaped. On the final page, a sentence in blood-colored ink. "You came back. Please don't go again." And yet, forward was the only direction that still existed. At the ship's core, a new chamber opened, one that had been sealed since launch. It had no purpose. No records. No manual entry. Inside was a wall covered in names. Thousands. None of which matched the current crew. They began to whisper them aloud, and one by one, the lights in the room dimmed with each name spoken, as if those names carried weight, or memory, or grief. Time slowed again. Each step became harder. Not from gravity, but emotion. They were carrying more than themselves now. The weight of the vanished. The echoes of those who had met the architect and been folded into its design. Some had chosen silence. Others had resisted. And others still had simply forgotten who they were, and remained here, timeless, echoing. In the final corridor before the next transition, a mirror awaited them. Not a tool. Not a test. Just a mirror. They looked into it and saw not their faces, but the faces of the ones who had gone before. Fearful. Brave. Lost. Smiling. Crying. Accepting. The black hole did not destroy. It transformed. And in doing so, it remembered. And now, so would they. Light had always meant clarity. Vision. Truth. Revelation. But now they had entered a place where light did not reveal, it concealed. It bent backwards, folding in layers, behaving more like fabric than wave. The deeper they traveled, the less light obeyed any law. Shadows twisted towards brightness. Brightness bled into black. Their eyes adjusted, but understanding did not. They had entered the world beneath light. The ship slowed, or time did. Ahead, a tunnel of radiance pulsed like a living throat. Not mechanical, not natural. Something in between, organic design shaped by thought. As they moved into it, reality began to thin. Surfaces stopped reflecting. Color detached from form. One reached for a control panel and watched their hand melt into sound. Language stopped functioning. Every word that formed in their minds was echoed by a second voice, deeper, older, not their own. It was not speaking to them. It was them, or the them that existed beyond space and identity. They had gone beyond memory. Now they were seeing with perception unfiltered by biology. The chamber opened like a mouth, vast and unmeasurable, and revealed the true heart of the black hole. It was not darkness. It was patterned spirals of decision, geometry built on the choices of trillions. Data woven into the shape of divinity. At the center stood a single structure. A spire, endless in height, formed from strands of translucent metal and what appeared to be bone. It pulsed with internal light, but not white. Not any color ever seen. A light that told stories just by existing. One by one, they were drawn toward it, not by force, but recognition. They knew this place. They had been here before. In dreams. In thoughts they never voiced. In the spaces between breath, they had felt this structure. It was the sum total of every possible outcome, encoded in architecture. A library of what could have been, bound by the gravity of unmade futures. The spire began to unfold. Each layer revealed moments, entire lives lived in other versions of reality. One saw themselves as a teacher, standing before children on a ruined earth. Another as a tyrant, weeping alone in a tower of mirrors. Another still as an old man with no name, planting a seed in a place with no sky. They were all true. They had all happened. Because time, here, was not linear. It was a garden. And the black hole was the gardener. They stepped forward and were swallowed by light. But not dissolved. Integrated. They began to remember futures. Not the ones they lived, but the ones they could have. Infinite. Eternal. Stacked like pages in a book the universe was still writing. This was no longer exploration. This was absorption. Their thoughts slowed. Their fears calmed. Their forms softened at the edges. They did not vanish, they became clear. Each of them, now illuminated from within, stood not as humans, but as iterations of the same question asked across time: what does it mean to exist? The spire answered not in voice, but in presence. It means to choose. In that moment, they were offered one final vision, a place, far away, untouched by this gravity. A world like Earth, but new. Untouched. Unnamed. They could leave. Return. Begin again. And never remember. Or they could stay. And become part of something larger than story. They hesitated. Not from doubt, but from reverence. For the first time in the entire journey, they were not afraid. Because the world beneath light had revealed the truth. They had never truly left Earth. They had only left their understanding of it. And now, they could decide, not as individuals, but as meaning made flesh. Far from the spire. Far from the world beneath light. Far from the echoing thoughts of the architect, the ship drifted alone now. Not because the crew had vanished, but because those who remained were not the same as those who had entered. They stood on the threshold of awareness, holding in their minds the unspoken memory of a choice none of them remembered making. Around them, the ship had changed again, familiar, but different. The walls pulsed with a faint heartbeat, as if it too had seen what they saw. The windows no longer showed stars, but fog dense and silver, filled with shadows that hinted at impossible structures far beyond reach. There was silence now, but it was not peace. It was wait. Not all had chosen to stay behind. Some returned. Or perhaps were returned. They could not say for sure. Time, memory, identity, all had become unreliable narrators of a reality that no longer bent to the rules of comprehension. They carried fragments of something sacred and terrifying, the knowing. It was not language. It was not memory. It was presence. They could feel each other's thoughts, not as words, but as rhythms, pulses in the dark, like sonar in the ocean of the void. They tried to speak, but sound fell short of meaning. They tried to rest, but sleep brought visions, not dreams, but reflections of things they might have become. Children they never raised. Cities they never walked. Sons they never saw die. One sat alone in the observation deck, watching the black hole behind them grow smaller, yet somehow feel closer. Another wandered the halls without direction, touching walls as if to remind themselves they were still made of matter. Another wept, not because they were sad, but because they no longer understood what sadness was supposed to feel like. No one asked if they had made the right decision. Right and wrong had dissolved inside the spire. There was only what is. Occasionally, they would hear something soft and rhythmic. Not mechanical. Not natural. A kind of lullaby, hummed by the ship itself. It had no melody, but it calmed the nerves like warm breath on cold glass. One among them began to draw symbols, shapes, spirals that made no sense and yet stirred ancient fear and comfort in equal measure. Another recorded a message, over and over, forgetting each time that the recorder was broken. Back on Earth, decades might have passed. Or minutes. But that world of green, chaotic, finite now felt like myth. A bedtime story told to minds too simple to comprehend the truth that waited in the dark. They were not heroes. Not victims. Not even explorers. They were leftovers. Those chosen to return. To witness. To carry the echo of something unspeakable. And as the ship resumed its slow voyage, unpiloted, unwatched, a final whisper brushed across each of their minds, gentle as fog, sharp as a scream long swallowed. You are not alone. You are not unchanged. You are not yet finished. And with that, they drifted, not away from the black hole, but deeper into the consequence of having survived it. It was remembering, slowly, painfully, that something had once mattered more than survival. The ship breached the final veil of the black hole's domain in silence. No alarms. No rupture. No fanfare. Only stillness, as if the cosmos itself acknowledged the completion of something sacred. Stars returned. Familiar constellations blinked into view, distant and indifferent. Time began to function again, seconds passed and could be counted. Gravity obeyed once more. The ship moved forward, but no one reached for the controls. They let it drift, unpiloted. The vessel, like its passengers, had learned autonomy in the abyss. But something was missing. Not a person. Not a system. But a sense of before. The ship's logs were intact, the mission data untouched. Yet reading it felt like recalling the biography of someone who no longer existed. The people named in the entries had not perished, they had merely transformed beyond recognition. Each of them began to see echoes. In shadows. In reflections. In the way sound bent unnaturally through certain hallways. They were not hallucinating. They were remembering future events, things that hadn't happened here, but had elsewhere. They had walked roads that now existed only in echo. One spent hours staring into a pool of water formed from a coolant leak, seeing in its cities built from silence. Another sat in the escape pod bay, staring at Earth's signal light blinking steadily across the void, as if it too had been waiting endlessly for their return. And yet, no one rushed to go back. They were homeward, but no longer of home. They had carried something back, not knowledge, but a shift in the geometry of the soul. Words felt inadequate. Images flickered and faded. Only in shared stillness could they truly feel understood. The architect, if that was its name, had not spoken in language. It had offered a mirror. And in that mirror, they had seen themselves stretched across possibility, broken down and rebuilt, until only essence remained. Not who they were, but why. That truth had no place in mission reports. It belonged to silence. Eventually, Earth responded. A voice, distorted by distance, crackled through the speakers, "We see you. Come home." But still they hesitated. Coming home meant pretending. It meant fitting a universe of impossible light and choice back into the small containers of human thought. Some began recording journals, not for Earth, but for whatever part of themselves might still be capable of forgetting. Others simply stared out the windows, waiting for the stars to blink in a pattern. They now understood not as beauty, but as invitation. And then, without vote, without command, the ship turned. Not back toward the black hole. Not toward Earth. But sideways, into a new trajectory. One written in silence, between coordinates. A place just beyond knowing. Because they had seen what lies inside the end. And now, they sought what lay beyond it. Not answers. Not God. Just reflection. A final one. In infinite light.